First of all, metabolic health. We've all heard the term metabolism a lot. It is a buzzword. It is a word that we hear perhaps too often, and even to the point that it's often misused. Metabolism, just to be very precise, is the balance of all of the chemical reactions that are happening in the body. There are biochemical reactions in every cell that are trying to build up molecules. Those are called anabolic reactions or anabolism. And there are biochemical processes that are degrading molecules, breaking them down. That is catabolism. And metabolism is the fusion or the balance of all of those things, the sum of all of those reactions. Now, with metabolic health, now we're starting to get more specific to the topic. There are generally, in my mind, two ways that we can define metabolic health. So the first definition is simply defining metabolic health or explaining it through the lens, looking at it through the lens of the metabolic syndrome. You've certainly heard of metabolic syndrome before. And it's nice to start with metabolic syndrome because that gives us some of the best statistics. As much as we're going to invoke and invite other ideas and principles throughout this lesson, unfortunately, they are a little more obscure to the point that there just isn't as much population or global level data. So if we start with the definition of metabolic health as some aspect of the metabolic syndrome, it helps us understand the scope of the problem, which is significant. The metabolic syndrome affects roughly half of all adults across the entire planet. That makes the metabolic syndrome the single most prevalent disease or health disorder in the world. That's why this topic matters so much. It's why I feel so justified and even gratified in having focused on metabolic health as a scientist for my profession, because it matters so much. The scope of the problem is so vast. Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of complications, in particular, 5 disorders that were noticed over the years to always clump together. They are, in no particular order, a bunch of highs and a low. So, high blood glucose, high waist circumference, high triglycerides, high blood pressure. Those are the highs, the 4 highs. And then lastly, the one low HDL. So let's just revisit those each very, very briefly. So the high glucose, that's no surprise. That's a sign of poor metabolic health. Your body's having a hard time clearing the glucose as you eat it, as you put it in your body. It's just lingering too long. And chronic hyperglycemia is pathogenic. It will certainly hurt the body. It can damage blood vessels and it can damage neurons and more. So that's important. High waist circumference, that evokes this idea of storing fat more centrally, particularly in the visceral space. And in future metabolic classrooms, we will revisit that topic, talking more about fat depots, where we store fat and why that matters. But more visceral fat is reflective of or contributes to higher inflammation and more general poor metabolic health. High triglycerides is a feature of the metabolic syndrome. That's the next one. And it is a very, very good predictor of heart disease risk. That's influenced by metabolic health. As the liver starts to suffer, it begins to overproduce triglycerides. At the same time, skipping one down, it starts to increase the clearance of HDL cholesterol, reducing HDL levels, considered to be the good or the beneficial version or carrier of cholesterol. And then lastly, it was the high blood pressure, which is directly related and a consequence, directly derivative of metabolic health. So those are the cluster of complications that make up the metabolic syndrome. Insulin resistance is at the heart of the metabolic syndrome. In fact, so much so that what we call the metabolic syndrome used to be called the insulin resistance syndrome. Let me take a moment and define insulin resistance. Every single chronic disease is in some way influenced by insulin resistance, where insulin resistance is either directly causing the disorder or it is facilitating the disorder. Insulin resistance is a disorder with really 2 parts. I like to invoke the analogy where insulin resistance is like a coin. If I were holding a coin in my hand and I say, this coin is insulin resistance, well, the coin has two sides. So too does insulin resistance. One part of insulin resistance is the actual resistance to the signal of insulin. Insulin is a peptide hormone made from the beta cells of the pancreas. You know that. And as it circulates in the blood, it will come and bind on receptors of every single cell of the body. That's one of the reasons insulin is so unique. As a peptide hormone, it is that every single cell of the body, from brain cells to bone cells, from lung cells to liver cells, and every cell in between, they all have insulin receptors. And so the receptor is essentially a doorway that is built for insulin to come and knock on. And insulin will knock on every door of every cell. So this is the insulin resistance part of it, though, where some of these cells aren't responding to insulin anymore as well as they used to. They've become resistant to that knock. So once upon a time, insulin would come and knock on the door of the cell, let's say the liver cell, and the door, if you will, would open right up and liver would respond appropriately. It would do what insulin asked it to do. However, over time, due to insults that we will talk about next episode, the knock falls on deaf ears. And the liver cell doesn't open the door all the time, or maybe it'll open at a crack. It doesn't actually do everything insulin wants it to do. That is the resistance part of insulin resistance. Now, please notice the deliberate use of language here. Not every cell becomes insulin resistant. This is not a universal phenomenon within the body. Some cells of the body fail to respond to insulin as effectively as they used to, or as sensitively as the response that you would expect. Now, we can flip that coin over because there's another aspect of insulin resistance, and this is the part that is so totally overlooked. And that is that in every instance of insulin resistance, with one exception that we'll talk about at a future classroom, insulin levels will also be elevated in the blood. So if we are now going from the level of the cell to the level of the whole body, at the cell there was this selective insulin resistance. At the whole body level, this is manifested as an elevated insulin level. Insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, which is the technical term for elevated blood insulin, are inseparable. They will always occur together, just like two sides of a coin. You can't get rid of one side. They're always going to be part of that coin. So too is insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. Now, that hyperinsulinemia part is relevant because remember, there are some cells that still respond to insulin as well as they used to, as well as they ever did. They're still insulin sensitive. So you have a handful of cells that are insulin resistant. So even though insulin levels are elevated, they're not responding that well to it. And so it generally is just a muted response anyway. However, the cells that are as insulin sensitive as ever are now overstimulated. There's too much response to the insulin because there's too much insulin relative to normal, healthy, insulin sensitive levels. Metabolic flexibility is the ability of the body to shift very readily between the two primary fuel sources. Now, the cells of the body actually have several fuel sources, but the primary fuel sources are fats and glucose. So at any moment, the body is either primarily fat burning or it's a mix of fat burning and, if you will, sugar burning, or blood sugar or blood glucose to be more precise. I'll just say sugar burning. It just has a good ring to it. So at any moment, that is the primary source of fuel for the body. And it shifts. There are times when the body is primarily fat burning, and there are other times when the body is primarily sugar burning. For example, if you were to eat a mixed macronutrient meal, it has carbs and fats and proteins. Because of the carbs, most especially, you should expect that if you were measuring fuel use in the body would shift primarily to sugar burning. Of course, that would be even more the case if you just ate pure carb. The body would heavily shift to sugar burning. Now give the body 6 hours or so, get into a fasted state, and you should shift over quite substantially to fat burning. So the body will shift. That would be a healthy response. When you're eating food, after that period of time that you've eaten, in that postprandial state or the post-eating state, you would shift to sugar burning. Give your body a couple hours or wake up the next day and you'll be in fat burning mode. That is metabolic flexibility. What this manuscript noted, that first identified metabolic inflexibility, is that there were some people who, even when they were in what should be a fasted state, they weren't transitioning out of sugar burning. They were staying in that sugar burning state, not entering into the fat burning state, even though the metabolic situation had changed. They hadn't been eating. They're fasted. It had been the same number of hours, whereas other study subjects had already gone to fat burning. They were still stuck primarily in sugar burning. In other words, their metabolism was inflexible. It had become rigid. The gears of the metabolic engine had become gummed up and stuck, if you will. Now, why? Of course, that's the next question. Now that you understand what metabolic inflexibility is, it is, in fact, the why of it is answered once again by invoking insulin resistance, or in this case, to be very precise, just elevated insulin. Insulin is, in fact, the director of which fuel is going to be used. If insulin is elevated, the body is obligatorily in sugar burning mode. If insulin is reduced, if insulin is low, then the body goes to fat burning mode. That is the single most important variable, or the dictator, in which fuel is going to be used. It's all about insulin. And again, to say that again, low insulin leads to fat burning. Elevated insulin leads to sugar burning. Now, let's come back to those people that were published in this report that were metabolically inflexible. Can you see why they might be stuck in sugar burning mode? Even when it had been hours since they'd eaten and others had long since moved into the state of fat burning, why were those people stuck in sugar burning? If elevated insulin is determining fuel use, elevated insulin, in fact, in this case, was the cause. These are people who are insulin resistant. And as you'll recall, one of the features of insulin resistance is elevated, indeed chronically elevated, blood insulin. Insulin is just staying too high all the time. And then you knowing now and remembering that metabolic inflexibility is really a manifestation, once again, just like the metabolic syndrome is, of insulin resistance. Now, one interesting tidbit from this, and an interesting aspect of metabolism, is that the longer insulin is reduced and the body is in fat burning, the more the body begins to burn more fat than it needs in order to meet its metabolic needs. Specifically, if we look at the liver, if insulin has been reduced for a substantial period of time, the liver, like many cells of the body, is primarily burning fat for fuel. It's in fat burning mode. And in fact, the fat burning goes on so much that because of the low insulin, the liver, in a way, can't stop burning fat. And normally, a cell will burn as much energy as it needs ATP. I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but or to say that another way, the cell will burn as much energy as it needs to do work. So the cell has a certain work demand, and it will burn enough energy to meet that demand. But if insulin is low for an extended period of time, the body, the liver in particular, continues to burn so much fat that it starts to burn more than it needs to meet its own energetic needs. And that excess is essentially what becomes ketones. Now, my point in bringing that kind of complicated description and introduction to ketones up is only that can become a bit of a surrogate marker. If you are, with regards to your metabolic flexibility or metabolic health, if you have fasted for, let's say, 16 hours and you have a way of measuring your ketones and you find that your blood ketone levels are still really low or undetectable, that suggests that you have high insulin levels, because insulin would stop. If insulin is high, it would stop the fat burning, which would stop the production of ketones, a process that is called ketogenesis. Insulin inhibits ketogenesis. And so if you've entered what should be a fasted state, but your insulin is still sufficiently high to inhibit ketogenesis, so your ketones are low, you have poor metabolic flexibility, or in other words, you are metabolically inflexible. In contrast, if you've fasted for about 16 or so hours, certainly this would be the case with even longer fasts, and you do see that you have entered into a higher level of ketones, whether you're measuring it in your breath or your urine or your blood with a finger stick, then you can be pretty confident that you have good metabolic flexibility, that in this fasted state you had shifted to fat burning, and to say that all another way, you'd have good confidence that you have good insulin sensitivity. But the last part of the lesson I want to discuss today is just to revisit this idea of how common the problem is. Why is it that insulin resistance has become the single most common health problem worldwide? There are two things that I want to touch on. The first is that our general medical or biomedical view and approach, and the clinical approach to insulin resistance, has actually inadvertently made the problem worse. So in this case, we've sort of selectively looked at certain aspects of the science surrounding insulin resistance and unwittingly accelerated the problem. When most medically trained individuals, or average individuals as well, who have no formal medical training, hear the term insulin resistance, or even when they just hear the word insulin, they immediately think of one thing. You think of glucose, you think of diabetes. Every time. In fact, just as a point of interest, you'll notice over my shoulder, for those of you that are watching, I have a copy of my book, Why We Get Sick. That book is, as a shameless plug, all about insulin resistance, including everything we're talking about this month. Why didn't I call it Insulin Resistance, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It? Because I knew nobody would buy it. They would immediately look at that title and just assume this was a book about diabetes, and they would think, well, I don't have diabetes, so I don't care. But that's not the case. But that is partly why the problem has become so prevalent. It's that we look at insulin resistance as a glucose problem. But earlier in my description and my definition of insulin resistance, what did I say was elevated? Did I say that the glucose is elevated in insulin resistance? No, I didn't. I said that the insulin is elevated in insulin resistance. And that therein lies the problem. That insulin resistance, also known as prediabetes, is a state where insulin levels are higher by necessity because insulin isn't working very well. And it also is, elevated insulin is both cause and consequence. And we'll revisit that next week. But elevated insulin is a cardinal feature of insulin resistance. The body has to work harder. Insulin has to work harder and higher in order to keep glucose levels in check. But it is capable of keeping glucose levels in check. And so you have an individual who may be manifesting year over year as they come into their clinic for their annual visit with various signs and symptoms of insulin resistance, like, for example, all of the features, save the high glucose, of the metabolic syndrome. They have higher blood pressure, they have dyslipidemia, they have elevated waist circumference. And the clinician is only measuring the glucose, which is coming up as normal every time. And so they say everything's fine. However, if they were to expand their view of the problem to include insulin as a marker, they would find that insulin levels can be elevated up to 20 years before glucose levels ever start to change. The problem with the traditional view of insulin resistance. The traditional view of insulin resistance is very glucose-centric. Because we have assigned the hormone insulin to having no more relevance than diabetes, we purely look at it through the lens of glucose. And so most conventional clinical tests that are attempting or speculating on the nature of insulin resistance or prediabetes, which is the same thing, are only looking at the glucose. The problem with that view is that, remember, insulin's most famous job, but not its most important. Insulin does all kinds of important things, and many critical things. Insulin's most famous effect is to correct what is a steady increase in glucose. So if glucose is going up, insulin will sense this, it will be mobilized, it will come up, and then open the doors of cells throughout the body, allowing the glucose to come down, which then allows the insulin to come back down. But they're not the same thing. Glucose is not insulin. Insulin is not glucose. That seems very obvious. But even still, there's this weird inability to disconnect the two ideas, where it's important for you to remember that insulin resistance is a state where insulin is elevated. That says nothing about the glucose. We don't know what the glucose is. In fact, glucose can be normal. And therein lies the rub. That's the problem, right? If we have a glucose-centric paradigm of insulin resistance, it's possible that the individual that we may be moving through the years, getting an annual blood test, and we are measuring only ever our glucose, and the glucose is staying normal. All the while, insulin is getting higher and higher and higher, working harder and harder in an effort to keep the glucose in check. But it is doing it. And then it's only once the body becomes so resistant to its insulin that even though insulin is still multiples higher than it should be, now the glucose starts to climb. And now we detect the problem 10 or even 20 years after the insulin had already been fighting. So insulin is the more sensitive signal. It's the canary in the coal mine, if you will. It gives us the earlier warning. Now, that brings us back to measuring what are the actual tests now that we can measure to determine your insulin resistance state. One of them is fasting insulin. Insulin is a marker of insulin resistance. Ideally, that number is less than 6 in a fasted state. So if you're doing a 12-ish hour fast, you would love for that number to be 6 microunits per mil. I'm, of course, in the US, so I'm giving US units. You can convert to picomoles as needed. And I believe the conversion would be around 30-ish or high 20s, maybe 27 picomole for those outside the US. So 6 microunits per mil. Now, however, what if it's a little higher than that? What if it is up to the mid-teens, for example? So I kind of have this other cutoff, which is you can be a little loose with this. But if someone has a fasted insulin between, say, 7 to 17 or so, that doesn't necessarily mean they're insulin resistant. Now, why do you ask? Elevated insulin is a sign of insulin resistance. It's because insulin has a rhythm to it, like so many hormones do. Not all hormones, but many. Insulin it'll ebb and it'll flow throughout the day. And it's entirely possible that you get your blood drawn at a moment when insulin was starting to climb up a little bit. For example, insulin will climb in the morning, and then it may do so again in the mid-afternoon, just as even in a purely fasted state. It's just part of its rhythm. Now, that I mentioned that second kind of category. If insulin is 6 or below, that's a really good sign that you're insulin sensitive. If it's in that intermediate realm, 7 to 17, that suggests there's a problem, but not absolute. And then if it's high teens, 18 and above, it's very likely that you are in fact insulin resistant and you've detected a true problem there. Now, what if it is in that middle range? In fact, even if it isn't, we don't need to stop with just fasting insulin. Insulin is volatile. It changes. So are there markers that are a little more stable? There are, albeit now we get into the realm of a little indirect with this one. But it is surprisingly accurate. And that is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. The triglyceride divided by HDL number. So you take your fasted triglycerides, which you get at every blood test. That's the benefit of this. It's not common to get insulin measured at a blood test, whereas we always will get our lipids measured. So you look at your blood test and you see your triglycerides, and then you divide triglycerides by the HDL number, and you always get HDL cholesterol. That will give you this ratio. And if it is less than 1.5, that's a really good sign. If it's above 1.5, that starts to get into the realm of being troublesome. It's a little problematic. So you'd want to be a little more cautious and assume that you have some degree of insulin resistance. So that's the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Now, the last test that I want to mention, remember, and we're all just kind of framing the conversation of how to fix insulin resistance. But my purpose in having this bit of a prequel tangent is to help you understand where you're at. The last one is my favorite one, which is called the Adipo-IR score. Adipo just for adipose. So it's the adipose insulin resistance score. This is a test that is looking at the insulin resistance at the fat cells. Now, why does that matter? Do you recall from our earlier conversation of the tissue that I said likely starts insulin resistance throughout the body. When you have this progressive and steady insulin resistance that's creeping into the person's life throughout the years, I submit that it's the fat tissue that becomes insulin resistant first. And thus, if you have a way of determining insulin resistance at the fat tissue, then you are detecting it potentially at its earliest possible stages. That's what the adipose insulin resistance score will tell us. Now, something that's so interesting about this is just the elegance of the biochemistry of what's happening at the fat cell, or the biology of the fat cell. Now, we know that the fat cells house this big droplet, I mean, relatively big, microscopically big, but big by cell standards, a big bubble of fat, if you will. And insulin is largely the signal, not the only one, but is a primary signal that's influencing the growing or the shrinking of that, what's called a lipid droplet, that big bubble of fat within the fat cell. If insulin is elevated, it is preventing the fat cell from breaking down its fat through a process called lipolysis. Insulin inhibits lipolysis. Now, the product of lipolysis, or the evidence of lipolysis in the blood, is something called free fatty acids, also sometimes referred to as non-esterified fatty acids. They're the same thing. FFAs or NEFAs, it's the same. I'm just going to call them free fatty acids to cut out a couple syllables for the sake of the discussion. So if insulin is elevated, free fatty acids should be down because insulin's inhibiting lipolysis. In contrast, if insulin is down through, say, a fasted state or low-carb diet, then you would expect free fatty acids to be higher because insulin is not present to inhibit lipolysis. And that's indeed what you'd get. So high insulin should be leading to reduced free fatty acids. Low insulin would lead to elevated free fatty acids. That's what this test is attempting to determine. The two parts of this formula is fasted insulin and fasted free fatty acids. Now, measuring free fatty acids is not common. It can be done, but it is not a common test. So you'd have to either go in and pay for it directly at LabCorp or Quest or something, or convince your clinician to check that box and hope your insurance will cover it. But it's a fascinating test. One of the reasons I'm so fascinated in it is its sensitivity of actually indicating metabolic problems. Now, I'm going to come back. I'm not done with this, but as an example, one of the very first papers I ever saw that used this study was looking at the degree of insulin resistance in otherwise healthy women who had PCOS. So they had women with and without polycystic ovary syndrome. So two groups of ladies controlled for age and even body weight and body fat. So they were the same overall body type. And yet, and in the women with PCOS in this particular study, they did not see signs of whole body insulin resistance. But when they looked at the fasted insulin in combination with the fasted free fatty acids, then, or in other words, the Adipo-IR score, they detected a significant increase in these women with PCOS. So the insulin resistance wasn't even manifesting at the level of the whole body, but it was evident at the level of the first tissue that becomes insulin resistant, namely the fat tissue. So if you've gotten those numbers, fasted insulin in microunits per mil, and the units are important here. So microunits per mil, and you multiply that number, fasted insulin in microunits per mil times free fatty acids in millimole. Now, thankfully, that's going to be millimole anywhere in the world. So that's going to be a pretty consistent unit. And you want that number to be below a certain cutoff, but it's different for men and women. Now, another little tangent here to explain why. At any given moment, women will have a free fatty acid level in her blood that can be up to 40 or even 50% higher than it is in a man. So if a man is manifesting with a free fatty acid of 1 millimolar, his healthy female counterpart is very likely going to be 1.5 millimolar free fatty acids. Women are constantly mobilizing fat from her fat cells much more than her male counterparts. And that's entirely a product of sex hormones, particularly the estradiols, estrogens, estradiol being the main one, the estrogens. Estrogens are promoting this higher rate of turnover of the fat cells. So at any moment, there's more fat coming out of the fat cell. And indeed, at any moment, A female is burning more fat. This will be the topic of a future metabolic classroom. But suffice it to say, women are fat burning machines relative to her male counterparts. Now, of course, the woman is rolling her eyes thinking, well, why do I have more fat? Because you're also putting more in to those fat cells, but again, you're taking more out. So that's where what I meant by the higher turnover, more going in, but more coming out. And that's evidenced as the higher free fatty acids. So what are the cutoffs? In a man, that Adipo-IR score is ideally less than 5. If his Adipo-IR score is less than 5, that suggests that his fat tissue is insulin sensitive. In a woman, that cutoff is 8. It's higher. She has a little more room there because her free fatty acids are naturally higher. Men and women will have generally similar levels of insulin, but when it comes to free fatty acids, no, not similar. Females will be higher because they're fat-burning machines because of the estrogens. And so her Adipo-IR score has to account for that, and thus the cutoff is higher. So women, if it's less than 8, thumbs up. Your fat tissue is insulin sensitive. Men, if it's less than 5, thumbs up. High five, you're doing well.